Think the beach is a place of peace? Think again. The ocean hides dark secrets, unspeakable horrors, and things that should never be disturbed. Tonight, we dive into true stories from the beach that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the shore. And trust me, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again. Story number 1. The plane ride had been long, turbulent, and filled with the kind of crying babies and loud seatmates that Eric Preston had hoped to avoid. By the time he stepped off the shuttle that took him from the airport to the beachside resort, his nerves were already frayed. But then he saw the ocean, stretching out before him like a promise of serenity, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This was supposed to be his chance to unwind, to leave behind the noise of his life, the demanding clients, the endless meetings, and the hollow, aching loneliness of an apartment that no longer felt like a home. Ever since his divorce 3 years ago, Eric had thrown himself into his work. And now, after his doctor warned him about high blood pressure and insomnia, this vacation had been less of a choice and more of a prescription. The resort itself was immaculate. Rows of pristine bungalows lined the sandy shoreline, their whitewashed walls gleaming in the golden light of the setting sun. Palm trees swayed lazily in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets only the wind could hear. The sound of the waves rolling in and out was soothing, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. A bellhop led Eric to his bungalow, a cozy yet modern space with wide windows that overlooked the ocean. The scent of salt and sand wafted in through the slightly open balcony door, mixing with the faint perfume of freshly laundered sheets. As the bellhop set down his luggage, Eric tipped him generously and wasted no time changing into a pair of shorts and a loose t-shirt. He had arrived just in time for sunset, and there was no way he was going to spend his first evening indoors. The beach was nearly deserted as he stepped onto the cool sand, the last of the resort guests retreating to their rooms or heading to the bar for dinner and drinks. Eric walked aimlessly, letting the waves kiss his toes and the evening breeze brush against his skin. For the first time in what felt like years, his mind began to quiet. And then, he saw her. She was standing where the water met the shore, her silhouette framed by the dying light of the sun. At first, Eric thought she might be another guest, perhaps a woman out for a quiet stroll like him. But something about her posture, the way she stood so still, gave him pause. Her long black hair fell in waves down her back, catching the last rays of sunlight. She wore a flowing white dress that clung to her figure and seemed to shimmer with an almost ethereal glow. Though he couldn't see her face from where he stood, there was something magnetic about her presence, something that made it impossible for him to look away. Eric took a tentative step forward, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "Hello," he called out, his voice hesitant, barely louder than the sound of the waves. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate. For a fleeting moment, Eric thought she was going to face him, but she didn't. Instead, she turned back toward the ocean and began walking into the waves. "Wait!" he called, his voice louder now, tinged with confusion and concern. But she didn't stop. The water reached her knees, then her waist, and then she was gone, swallowed by the sea. Eric froze, his feet sinking slightly into the damp sand. His heart pounded in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the strangeness of it all, the way she had appeared and vanished without a word. Or maybe it was the unnerving sense of familiarity she had stirred within him, as though he had seen her before in a dream or a memory he couldn't quite place. He scanned the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But the ocean was empty. The waves rolled in and out, indifferent to his confusion. "Probably just a swimmer," he muttered to himself, though he didn't entirely believe it. He turned and headed back to his bungalow, the image of her figure lingering in his mind. That night, as he lay in bed, the sound of the waves lulling him to sleep, He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen the last of her. Eric awoke to the sound of waves crashing harder than usual against the shore. It was still dark outside, the kind of pre-dawn hour when the world felt suspended between dreams and reality. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the grogginess that clung to him, and glanced at the clock. 4:17 a.m. Something had stirred him awake, something beyond the sound of the ocean. He sat up, straining his ears, and that's when he heard it. A soft, melodic hum drifting through the air. It wasn't the sound of the ocean or the wind. It was distinctly human. A woman's voice, faint but undeniably beautiful, carried on the breeze. His pulse quickened as he got out of bed and stepped onto the balcony. The beach was bathed in pale moonlight, the waves glowing faintly under the night sky. And there, standing in the surf, was the woman from the night before. She looked even more mesmerizing now, her white dress clinging to her wet form as though it were part of her skin. Her hair gleamed under the moonlight, cascading down her shoulders in inky waves. She wasn't humming anymore. She was simply standing there, staring out at the ocean as if it held some unspoken secret. Eric's rational mind told him to go back inside, to dismiss this as the odd behavior of a stranger. But curiosity, and something deeper, something he couldn't name, compelled him to leave the bungalow and walk toward her. The sand was cold under his bare feet as he approached, his heart pounding with every step. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the way her hair swayed in the breeze, but not so close as to startle her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to catch a glimpse of her profile. Her skin was impossibly smooth, almost luminous in the moonlight, and her eyes, dark, endless pools, locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight, as though her words held more meaning than he could grasp. Eric blinked, caught off guard. "Waiting for me? I don't even know you." A faint smile curved her lips, a smile that was both alluring and unsettling. "Don't you?" Her words sent a chill down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. Something about her felt familiar, like a half-forgotten dream that lingered just out of reach. Before he could respond, she took a step closer, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. "Come with me," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his soul. Eric hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but her eyes held him captive, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Against his better judgment, he nodded and followed her into the surf. The water was icy, sending a shock through his system as it lapped at his ankles. She didn't seem to notice the cold, moving with a grace that was almost unnatural. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "To see the truth," she replied, her tone calm, almost hypnotic. As they walked deeper into the ocean, Eric felt the pull of the tide grow stronger, almost as if the water itself were urging him forward. The waves rose higher, reaching his knees, then his thighs. He glanced back at the shore, now a distant sliver of sand, and felt a pang of unease. "Wait," he said, stopping in his tracks. "I can't swim." She turned to face him fully for the first time, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "You don't need to swim," she said, her voice as soothing as it was ominous. And then she smiled, a smile that was both breathtakingly beautiful and terrifyingly predatory. Before Eric could react, a wave crashed over him, pulling him under. The cold was suffocating, the water pressing against his chest as he struggled to surface. Panic clawed at him as he thrashed against the current, his lungs burning for air. Just as he thought he would drown, he felt a hand grip his arm and yank him upward. He broke the surface, gasping for breath, and found himself staring into her eyes once more. "Not yet," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "You're not ready." The next thing he knew, he was back on the shore, coughing up seawater as he lay sprawled on the sand. The woman was gone, the ocean stretching out before him like an indifferent abyss. As he sat there, shivering and drenched, one thought echoed in his mind. What the hell just happened? Eric sat on the cold sand, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The icy grip of the ocean still lingered on his skin, and the woman's piercing gaze haunted him like a shadow. The shoreline stretched out before him, empty and silent, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a hallucination. But it wasn't a dream. He could feel the burn in his lungs, the sting of salt water in his eyes, and the residual pressure of her grip on his arm. The woman had been real, and she had saved him. Or had she? Shaking, Eric stood and stumbled back toward his bungalow. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ocean itself were trying to pull him back. When he reached the porch, he noticed something strange. A faint trail of wet footprints leading from the water's edge to his door. They weren't his. His breath hitched as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with a damp, briny scent, as if the sea had followed him in. He scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything appeared normal, except for the mirror on the wall. It was fogged over, as if someone had breathed on it, and in the center, a single word was scrawled in dripping letters. Leave. Eric's blood ran cold. He backed away, his mind racing with questions. Who had written it? Was it the woman? And if so, why was she warning him? A sudden knock at the door made him jump. His first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent. Gathering what little courage he had left, he opened the door to find a wiry old man standing on the porch. The man's face was weathered, his eyes sharp and knowing. He wore a tattered fisherman's jacket, and his expression was one of grim urgency. "You're the new guy, aren't you?" the man said, his voice rough like gravel. Eric nodded, too stunned to speak. "You need to leave," the man continued, his gaze darting toward the ocean. "Tonight, don't wait for sunrise. Just pack your things and go." "What are you talking about?" Eric asked, his voice shaky. "Why would I leave?" The old man sighed, his shoulders sagging as though burdened by a weight he'd carried for years. "You saw her, didn't you? The woman?" Eric froze. "How do you know about her?" "Because you're not the first," the man said, his tone grave. "She appears to men like you, alone, curious, easy to lure, and once she's got you, you're as good as gone." "That doesn't make any sense," Eric said, his voice rising. "Who is she? What does she want?" The old man hesitated, his eyes clouded with a mix of fear and pity. "She's not human. Never was. Some say she's a siren, others say she's the ghost of a woman who drowned here centuries ago. But it doesn't matter what she is. What matters is that she feeds." "Feeds?" Eric echoed, his stomach twisting. "On men's souls," the man said bluntly. "She draws them in, makes them think they've found something beautiful, something worth dying for. And then she drags them under and takes everything. Your life, your essence, your very being." Eric's mind reeled. "But she saved me. She pulled me out of the water." The old man's expression darkened. "She didn't save you. She's toying with you, making you think you're special. But you're not. None of them were." A chill ran down Eric's spine. "What do you mean, none of them?" The old man gestured toward the beach. "This place has a history. Men have gone missing here for decades. Some locals believe it's bad luck. Others know the truth but keep quiet, hoping she won't notice them. But you," he pointed a bony finger at Eric, "she's noticed you. And if you don't leave now, you won't get another chance." Eric's pulse quickened. The logical part of his brain wanted to dismiss the old man's story as nonsense, the ramblings of a superstitious local. But deep down, he knew it was true. He had felt her pull, her power. "Why are you telling me this?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I've seen too many men vanish," the old man said, his voice tinged with regret. "And because I've survived. Barely. She marked me once, long ago, but I was smart enough to run. You should be too. Before Eric could respond, the old man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Eric stood there for a long moment, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and disbelief. Finally, he closed the door and locked it, as if that simple act could keep the darkness at bay. But deep down, he knew the truth. Locks wouldn't protect him from her. Sleep didn't come easily for Eric that night. Every creak of the bungalow, every whisper of the ocean breeze seemed amplified, crawling under his skin like the salt in the air. He tossed and turned, trying to rationalize everything the old man had told him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's warning was more than just superstition. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the curtains, Eric had made a decision. He would leave. He would pack his bags, check out of the bungalow, and put as much distance as possible between himself and this cursed stretch of beach. As he sat up in bed, however, a wave of exhaustion hit him. His muscles felt heavy, as though weighted down by sandbags. His thoughts were sluggish, his vision blurry. It felt like he hadn't slept at all, despite the hours he had spent in bed. A low hum reached his ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from outside. Eric walked to the window, his legs trembling beneath him. He pulled the curtain aside, and his breath caught in his throat. The woman was there, standing ankle-deep in the surf. Her long, dark hair billowed around her like a veil, and her eyes glowed faintly in the pale morning light. She wasn't looking at him, but he knew. Somehow, he knew. She was there for him. The old man's words echoed in his mind. She's noticed you. And if you don't leave now, you won't get another chance. But he couldn't move. His feet were glued to the floor, his hands clutching the curtain with a force that turned his knuckles white. And then, as if sensing his presence, she turned her head toward him. Her eyes locked onto his, and Eric felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was like being submerged in warm water, weightless and free. The fear that had gripped him moments ago faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm. He didn't realize he was moving until his bare feet hit the cool sand. The door to the bungalow hung open behind him, swaying slightly in the breeze. The woman stood motionless as he approached, her expression serene but unreadable. The waves lapped at her feet, and for a brief moment, Eric thought she looked impossibly beautiful, like something out of a dream. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Why are you?" The question caught him off guard. I needed to get away," he stammered, "to clear my head." She stepped closer, the water parting effortlessly around her. "And did you?" Eric hesitated. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to run, to heed the old man's warning and leave while he still could. But her presence was intoxicating, pulling him closer like the tide. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe." Her smile widened, but there was something unsettling about it, something predatory. "You're searching for something," she said softly. "Something you've lost." Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. Her touch was cool, almost soothing, but it sent a shiver down his spine. "Come with me," she whispered. "I'll show you." Eric's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to resist, to pull away, but his body betrayed him. He followed her into the surf, the cold water biting at his skin. The further they went, the darker the water became. The shore faded into the distance, replaced by an endless expanse of black waves. And then she stopped. Eric looked around, his pulse quickening. There was nothing but water in every direction. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness, and the ocean seemed unnaturally calm. "What are we doing here?" he asked, his voice cracking. She turned to face him, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You'll see," she said, her voice low and melodic. Before he could react, she lunged at him, her hands gripping his shoulders with inhuman strength. The water erupted around them and Eric was dragged beneath the surface. Eric's world dissolved into a churning maelstrom of icy water and crushing darkness. He flailed wildly, desperate to break free from the woman's iron grip, but her strength was otherworldly. Her glowing eyes pierced through the gloom, locked onto his as she pulled him deeper into the abyss. The water was suffocating, heavy against his chest as his lungs screamed for air. He clawed at her hands, her arms, but her grip didn't waver. Around him, the faint outlines of shapes swirled, a forest of shadows, distorted and fleeting. Just as the last of his air escaped in a trail of bubbles, Eric felt the current shift. The suffocating pressure lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't underwater anymore. He was standing, somehow dry, on a rocky ledge in a cavern. The walls shimmered faintly, as if coated with a thin layer of iridescent algae, casting a ghostly glow over the space. Eric stumbled forward, coughing and gasping. His limbs felt weak, his head spinning. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Where am I?" he whispered hoarsely. The only response was the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. The cavern stretched endlessly before him, its jagged walls forming unnatural shapes that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. Pools of dark water dotted the ground, their surfaces unnervingly still. And then he saw it, a figure standing at the far edge of the cavern. It was the woman, or at least it looked like her. But something was different now. Her skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent hue, and her hair floated around her as if suspended in water. She was no longer beautiful. She was monstrous. "Eric," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the cavern. He froze. "You've come so far," she continued, stepping closer. Her movements were fluid, almost serpentine. "You've seen things most men never will. And now, you belong to me." Eric backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "I don't belong to anyone," he shouted. "I just want to leave." Her laughter was cold and hollow, reverberating through the cavern. "Leave?" she repeated, tilting her head. "There is no leaving, Eric. Not anymore." As she spoke, the pools of water around him began to ripple. Slowly, figures emerged from their depths, pale, gaunt shapes with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They moved toward him with an unsettling grace, their skeletal hands reaching out. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he recognized some of their faces. They were the missing men, the ones the old man had spoken of. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be real." But it was real. The figures closed in, their mournful wails filling the air. He turned to run, but the cavern seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no escape. The woman watched him, her expression cold and detached. "You were so eager to find something," she said, "to escape your mundane life. Well, here it is, Eric. Eternity." He stumbled, falling to his knees as the spectral figures surrounded him. Their hands were cold as they gripped his arms, his shoulders, pulling him down. The floor beneath him dissolved into water, and he was dragged beneath the surface once more. The water swallowed Eric again, its icy grip relentless. He thrashed and struggled, but the spectral hands tightened around him, pulling him into the endless depths. The glowing cavern above faded, replaced by an oppressive, Stygian blackness. Eric's screams were silenced by the water flooding his mouth. Panic clawed at him as his vision blurred and his chest burned with the unbearable need for air. The pale faces of the spectral men surrounded him, their empty eyes staring, their mouths moving as though they were whispering secrets only they could hear. Then, as suddenly as he had been pulled down, he was still. Eric's lungs didn't burn anymore. The crushing weight of the water was gone. He was standing again, though the ground beneath him felt wrong, soft and unsteady. like walking on shifting sand. Around him was an infinite expanse of darkness, pierced by faint, flickering lights in the distance. A voice broke the silence. "You don't belong here," it said. Eric spun around to see one of the spectral men standing before him, its gaunt features unnervingly human, but utterly devoid of life. What is this place?" Eric stammered. "This is where she keeps us," the figure replied, its voice a low, hollow echo. "Her prison, her feast." Eric shook his head. No, I'm not staying here. I'll find a way out." The figure tilted its head, a sad, almost pitying expression on its face. "There is no way out, not for us." "Why are you helping me then?" Eric demanded. "Because we were like you once," the figure said, "and now we are nothing. If you fight, perhaps you can escape her grasp before it's too late." Before Eric could respond, the darkness shifted. The flickering lights in the distance began to grow brighter, revealing countless pale, hollow figures standing silently in the void. And then she appeared. The woman, or the creature, emerged from the shadows, her glowing eyes fixed on Eric. Her beauty was gone, replaced by a grotesque alien visage. Her skin rippled as if alive, her limbs unnaturally elongated. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice a chilling melodic hiss. "You are mine now." Eric's fear turned to anger. "You've taken enough from me," he shouted. "I won't let you keep me here." Her laughter was like the breaking of waves, calm, yet carrying an undeniable threat. "You think you have a choice?" As she advanced, the spectral figures surrounded Eric, their mournful wails filling the void. He backed away, his mind racing. If this place was her domain, there had to be a way to break her hold. Suddenly he remembered the pendant, the strange, jagged shell he had picked up on the beach. He reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The shell pulsed with an otherworldly light, and the creature recoiled, hissing in fury. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice now sharp and venomous. "I don't know," Eric said, gripping the shell tightly. "But it's the only thing keeping you away from me." The creature's form twisted and writhed, her features becoming more monstrous by the second. "You cannot escape," she screamed, lunging toward him. In a desperate move, Eric held the shell out in front of him. It flared with blinding light, and the darkness around him shattered like glass. Eric woke up on the beach, his body trembling and soaked. The sun was rising, casting a warm golden glow over the waves. He coughed and gasped, the salty air filling his lungs. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But when he looked down, the shell was still in his hand, its surface now dull and lifeless. Eric staggered to his feet, staring out at the horizon. He didn't know how he had escaped or why the shell had saved him. But one thing was certain. He would never set foot on this beach again. As he turned to leave, he felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced back at the water and froze. Far out in the waves, a figure stood, watching him. Her glowing eyes burned with fury, and her voice echoed faintly on the wind. "This isn't over, Eric." The ocean roared, and Eric ran, leaving the beach and its horrors behind. Story number 2. The beach was breathtaking. A stretch of untouched shoreline where the water seemed to shimmer in hues of turquoise and emerald, gently lapping against the soft sand. Sunlight bathed the landscape in golden warmth, making the scene seem like something out of a dream. But beneath the beauty, something lurked, a malevolent presence that no one could quite comprehend. A group of tourists arrived in the early afternoon. Their car windows rolled down as they made their way through the coastal road, winding and narrow, with thick trees on either side. They had heard whispers of the beach, the hidden gem that few knew about, but those who did spoke of its haunting allure. "You know," said Sarah, a young woman with dark brown eyes and a smile that could light up a room. "This place feels like it's from another time, like we've stepped into some forgotten corner of the world." Her boyfriend Tom, who had been driving, looked over at her with a grin. "I think that's the point. It's isolated, pristine, untouched by the usual crowd. They had decided to come here on a whim, looking for an escape from the usual tourist traps and seeking something unique. They weren't the only ones. The small group had come together by chance, strangers now bound by the allure of an isolated paradise. There was Lisa, a photographer from New York who specialized in nature shots. Marcus, an avid history buff who had been dying to visit the area. And Jenna, a quiet woman who had said little since they left the city. As they pulled into the small parking lot near the entrance to the beach, the air felt thick, heavy with an unfamiliar weight. The breeze, though warm, carried a strange saltiness, sharper than usual. It stirred unease in the pit of Sarah's stomach, though she didn't voice it. The group unloaded their bags and made their way down a narrow, winding path lined with overgrown foliage and tall grasses, leading them straight to the water's edge. The first thing Sarah noticed was the sand. It wasn't like any sand she had ever seen. Instead of the usual pale gold, it was darker, grayish-brown, with an unusual rough texture. As her feet sank into the grains, she felt a slight, unsettling crunch beneath her sandals. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was nothing. "This is gorgeous," Lisa said, setting up her camera as she eyed the scene. "I'm definitely going to get some great shots here." Marcus knelt to examine the sand, a thoughtful frown crossing his face. "Odd. It's not like the other beaches around here. This sand feels off." "You mean it's coarse?" Tom asked, walking over to join him. "Not just that," Marcus said, lifting a handful of sand and letting it slip through his fingers. "It's the color. There's something about it. It feels almost wrong." "Stop overthinking it, Marcus," Sarah said lightly, trying to brush off the strange feeling in the air. "Let's just enjoy the day. I'm sure it's nothing." But as they spread out across the beach, Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the strange sensation she couldn't shake. Something was wrong with this place. Jenna, who had been quiet until now, walked along the shoreline, her feet barely touching the water. She stopped at a small rock, her face pale. "There's something in the water. Something moving." She pointed, her voice low, almost fearful. The others quickly gathered around, squinting into the shimmering sea. But there was nothing to see, just the steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore. Sarah glanced at the others, noting the confusion in their eyes. "It's just the tide, Jenna," she said, trying to sound reassuring. Jenna shook her head. "No, I saw something. It looked like a body." Her words hung in the air, unsettling in their implication. But Sarah quickly dismissed them. "You're probably just imagining things. Let's go check out the cliffs over there. We can take some pictures." They spent the next few hours exploring the beach, but the feeling of being watched never left. As evening approached, a thick fog began to roll in from the sea, blanketing the shoreline in an eerie shroud. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the sand. The atmosphere grew heavy, and the distant cries of gulls seemed to have faded into nothingness. As night began to fall, Sarah and the group set up camp on the beach, eager to enjoy their final moments of peace. The air grew cooler, and the distant sound of the waves was now punctuated by strange whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the depths of the sand itself. Tom lit a small fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across their faces as they gathered around it. Despite the beauty of the setting, there was something unsettling in the air, an undercurrent of dread that none of them could explain. Jenna, who had been the most uneasy all day, finally spoke. I don't think we should stay here. Something's wrong with this place. I feel it." Her voice trembled. "Jenna, you're just scared," Tom said, though his own voice lacked conviction. "It's just a beach. Nothing to worry about." But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here. She remembered the stories she had read before their trip, of a beach hidden away from the world, where strange things were said to occur, where people who visited never came back. At first, she had dismissed it as superstition, but now, standing on the beach as the fog thickened around them, the stories felt too close to reality. They decided to settle for the night, hoping to escape the eerie unease that lingered over them. But as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, coming from all directions, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her skin prickling with cold fear. At first, the whispers were barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then, they began to form words, too faint to understand clearly. The group exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak, afraid of breaking the fragile silence. The flames of the fire danced erratically, flickering as if disturbed by an unseen force. Suddenly, a sharp cry rang out, cutting through the night. It was Lisa, who had been taking photographs near the cliffs. She stumbled back toward the group, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something on the cliffs," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "A figure. A man. He's watching us. I don't think he's human." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, as if something beneath the sand had stirred to life. The whispers escalated into a maddened cacophony, a choir of tortured voices begging for release. And then, from the depths of the beach, something rose. Shadows twisting and crawling, a mass of writhing, contorted shapes. The sand, which had seemed so lifeless, now seemed to pulse with a horrific energy. It began to churn, as though alive, moving with a mind of its own. The tourists stood frozen, unable to move, their eyes fixed on the horrifying sight unfolding before them. The shore, long thought to be a peaceful paradise, began to claim its prize. The beach wasn't just made of sand, it was made of the crushed bones of those who had fallen victim to its curse, souls bound to it for eternity, feeding it with their suffering. "Run!" Sarah screamed, breaking the spell, but it was too late. The beach had already begun to claim its first victim. The group scrambled, their feet slipping on the damp sand as the eerie whispers grew louder, surrounding them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the once solid beach now undulating as though it had a life of its own. Sarah's heart raced, adrenaline pumping through her veins as she grabbed Tom's hand, pulling him toward the path they had walked earlier. The others were behind her, their panicked footsteps following, but the thick fog that now enveloped the beach made it hard to see anything clearly. "Where do we go?" Lisa shouted, her voice breaking as she looked around frantically. Her camera hung limply from her neck, forgotten in the chaos. "We need to get to the car," Marcus said, his voice shaking but with a hint of determination. "We can't stay here." But Sarah could see it now. The ground beneath their feet was no longer sand. It was something darker, more sinister. The sand seemed to bleed, a dark liquid oozing from the earth itself, as though the beach were alive and feeding. The whispers morphed into anguished cries, wailing from deep below, begging for release from the hell they had been trapped in. It was then that she saw it. Something was moving in the fog, something large and unnatural, its shape twisting in the mist. Her blood ran cold as the figure took form. A man, but not entirely. His body was covered in dark, viscous fluid that gleamed in the pale light of the moon. His face was a grotesque mask, his eyes hollow, black as the depths of the sea. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, though it felt like the words weren't her own. The figure advanced slowly, each step causing the sand beneath him to writhe, the bones of the past breaking and shifting underfoot. As he drew closer, The cries of those trapped beneath the shore grew louder, more desperate. It was as if the very beach was alive, feeding on the souls of the lost. "Run!" Marcus screamed, and the group broke into a sprint, the crunch of the sand beneath them now sounding like the cracking of bones, each step feeling like a violation of the earth itself. The fog thickened, enveloping them completely, and Sarah felt a suffocating pressure in her chest, as if the air itself were trying to drag her down into the ground. She stumbled, her foot catching on something hard, and she barely managed to catch herself before crashing to the ground. Tom reached out to help her, but before he could grasp her hand, a cold, clammy hand seized his ankle, pulling him down into the sand. Sarah screamed in horror as she watched Tom struggle, his face contorting in terror as his body was slowly dragged beneath the earth. "Tom!" she cried, but her voice was lost in the increasing chaos. Lisa and Marcus had already reached the path, but Jenna, who had been lagging behind, had vanished into the fog. Sarah's heart clenched. Where had she gone? She couldn't afford to think about it. The figure was closer now, his dark presence radiating a palpable evil, his hollow eyes fixed on Sarah as though he were savoring her fear. She forced herself to move, to run, but each step felt heavier, as though the beach itself was trying to pull her down. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers of the lost souls grew louder, almost deafening. She could hear Marcus yelling ahead, urging her to hurry, but his voice seemed distant, as though it were coming from far away. The fog closed in around them, and Sarah could no longer see the way forward. The path they had walked earlier was no longer clear, the world around her becoming a maze of shifting shapes and distorted sounds. And then, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of something scratching, scraping. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest, and saw the ground before her heave once again. It was the sand. It was shifting, the grains parting, revealing a twisted skeletal hand reaching out from beneath the earth. And then another, and another. She froze, her blood running cold as the hands began to emerge, dragging themselves from the sand. They were not human, at least not entirely. The skin was pale and stretched thin over exposed bone, their fingers clawing at the air in a desperate attempt to free themselves. One of the creatures rose fully, its body an amalgamation of bones and decayed flesh, its face a grotesque mask of agony. Its hollow eyes locked onto Sarah, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. She recoiled in horror, but the creature lurched toward her, its hands reaching out as it dragged its broken body across the sand. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice cut through the fog, distant but urgent. "This way!" "Sarah!" Marcus's voice cut through the fog, distant but urgent. "This way!" She turned, her mind barely processing what was happening around her. The beach was alive, and it was feeding on them, pulling them into the depths of the earth to join the countless souls that had been sacrificed before. They had made a terrible mistake. This beach was not a paradise. It was a prison, a place of endless suffering. She ran toward Marcus's voice, but as she stumbled forward, the earth beneath her feet cracked open. She screamed as she fell, her body plunging into the darkness below. The world spun as she descended, her hands scraping against the rough earth, but it was no use. The sand had taken hold of her, pulling her deeper, farther from the surface, as though the beach itself was trying to consume her. And then, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, filling her mind with the voices of the lost. She could hear their pain, their torment, their desperate cries for release. She could feel their hands reaching for her, pulling her toward them. Number. She refused to give in. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah pushed against the sand, forcing herself upward. But it was as though the ground was fighting her, pulling her back into the abyss. She screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the fire they had abandoned. It seemed so far away now, as though it belonged to another world entirely. She had to get to it. She had to get out. But the figure, the one who had been watching them, the one who had been leading them to their doom, was closer now, his twisted form emerging from the mist. He moved like a predator, stalking his prey. His smile was grotesque, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. She tried to stand, but her body felt heavy, her muscles weak. The whispers were louder now, deafening in their urgency. They were calling to her, urging her to join them, to give in. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, a voice rang out through the darkness. "Run! Run! Now!" It was Marcus. She saw him standing at the edge of the beach, his face a mask of terror. He was waving his arms frantically, urging her to get up, to move. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, at the figure. The creature lunged, but it was too late. In a blur of motion, Marcus turned and bolted toward the cliffs, away from the shore, away from the nightmare that had taken hold of them. Sarah's mind screamed at her to follow, but her legs refused to cooperate. She was sinking, and the whispers were closing in, the darkness pulling her under. But then, something strange happened. A gust of wind swept across the beach, stirring the fog and blowing it away. For the first time since they had arrived, the air was clear. The sand stopped moving. The whispers stopped. Sarah gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The beach was silent now. Too silent. She turned and saw Marcus still running, his figure disappearing into the distance. But the figure, the thing that had haunted them, the thing that had led them to this hellish nightmare, was gone. The beach was still, as if nothing had ever happened. And for a brief moment, Sarah dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. But she was wrong. The beach was not done with them. The morning sun barely broke through the fog, casting a dim, ghostly light over the shore. Sarah stood on the edge of the beach, her body aching from the harrowing night she had just endured. Her hands were stained with dark, sticky sand, and her legs trembled from exhaustion. She had barely escaped, and even now a faint echo of the whispers lingered in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. She turned slowly, taking in the scene before her. The beach, once so inviting with its pristine white sands and crystal-clear waters, now looked like a graveyard. The beauty had been replaced by something far darker, something sinister. The ocean, which had once shimmered so invitingly, now rolled in sluggish gray waves, as though the sea itself had been drained of life. Where was Marcus? She had seen him running. She had seen him move toward the cliffs, but in the chaos, she had lost track of him. Was he still alive? Had he escaped? Or had the beach claimed him too? The silence that hung over the beach was suffocating. She should have felt relief, but instead, dread filled her chest, the weight of the horror still pressing down on her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure emerge from the fog, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds. Only the soft crash of waves on the shore. She had to find Marcus. She had to make sure he was okay. With shaky steps, Sarah turned away from the shore, her eyes scanning the cliffs in the distance. The path Marcus had taken was steep, winding, and dangerous, but she had no choice. She had to climb. She had to get away from the cursed sand before it took her too. She forced herself to move, each step feeling like a battle against the weight of the night. Her hands scraped against the rough rocks as she made her way up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every part of her screamed to turn back, to go home, to forget this nightmare. But she couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. The higher she climbed, the more oppressive the air became. The fog had cleared somewhat, but it still clung to the edges of the cliffs, curling like serpents around the rocks. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, trying not to think about what lay behind her, what might still be waiting for her in the depths of the beach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah reached the top of the cliffs. She paused, leaning against the rocks, her chest heaving as she looked around. The world before her seemed eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. There was no sign of Marcus, no sign of anyone. But something was wrong. The air here felt different, cold and heavy, as if it were thick with the weight of something unseen. Sarah's senses were on edge, every nerve in her body alert to the slightest sound, the faintest movement. And then, she saw it. At the edge of the cliff, partially hidden by the mist, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure that seemed to shimmer in the strange light. It stood motionless, its back to her. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the shape, the posture. It was Marcus. Relief flooded through her, and without thinking, she moved toward him, calling out his name. "Marcus!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. "Marcus!" she called again, louder this time, her voice filled with desperation. She was almost there, just a few more steps, and she would reach him. But something was wrong. The figure stood perfectly still, as though frozen in place. And then, slowly, it turned. Sarah froze in horror. It wasn't Marcus. Not anymore. The figure before her had the same height, the same build, but its face was twisted, its features distorted beyond recognition. Its eyes were empty, hollow voids, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque, unnatural grin. The skin on its face seemed to be peeling away, revealing the raw, bloody muscle beneath. The figure's hands, Marcus's hands, were now claws, long and bony, with jagged nails that scraped against the rocks. "Sarah!" the creature rasped, its voice a terrible mockery of Marcus's. Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. The creature took a step forward, its eyes locking onto hers. It was him, or at least it had been once, but now he was a vessel, a twisted imitation of the person she had known. "Run, Sarah!" Marcus's voice whispered again, but this time it was more like a guttural growl. "Run, before the beach comes for you too." And then, the world around her exploded in a deafening roar. The beach. The sand. It was alive. Sarah barely had time to react before the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and the entire cliffside trembled. Rocks dislodged themselves from the cliff and plummeted into the water below. The creature, Marcus's body, lurched toward her, its hands outstretched, reaching for her. In that moment, everything that had happened, everything that had led them to this cursed place, came crashing down on Sarah. The beach hadn't let them go. It had been waiting for them to arrive, to feed on their flesh. And now it was coming for her, for all of them. The sacrifice was not yet complete. With a scream, Sarah turned and ran, not daring to look back. The ground trembled beneath her feet, as though the entire island was waking up, coming alive. Behind her, the creature howled, its voice mingling with the deafening crash of waves against the shore. She didn't stop, couldn't stop, as the world around her seemed to collapse into chaos. As she descended back toward the beach, the mist thickened again, swirling around her in a suffocating embrace. The sand beneath her feet seemed to shift with every step, as if trying to drag her down into its depths. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, calling her name, pleading with her to join them. The beach wanted her, needed her, to complete the curse. But Sarah refused. She pushed forward, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion, her mind consumed with only one thought: survival. She had to survive. She didn't know where she was running to. She didn't know what would happen next, but she couldn't stay here, not in this nightmare. And then she saw it, a dark shape in the distance, a structure rising from the fog. It looked like a house, or at least what was left of one. It was battered, half destroyed, but it might offer shelter, a chance to escape the horror that was chasing her. She ran toward it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the sand crunching beneath her feet. She didn't look back. she didn't dare. The beach was still hungry, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The beach didn't forgive. The fog was thick, suffocating. As Sarah stumbled through the uneven terrain, her breath ragged, her body drenched in cold sweat. She had no idea how far she had run, or how much time had passed since she had seen Marcus, since she had seen that horrific, twisted version of him. The world around her felt unreal, distorted by the terror that gripped her. Each step she took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath her was pulling her back into the nightmare she had tried to escape. And yet, in the distance, she could see the silhouette of the house, its jagged outline barely visible through the mist. It seemed so out of place, like a relic of another time. The house was old, decrepit, its walls sagging with age and decay. Broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges, as though it had been abandoned for years. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran toward it with all the strength she had left, ignoring the pain in her legs, the burning in her lungs. She needed shelter. She needed to escape. And if the house was all she had, then it would have to do. As she reached the front door, she pushed against it with trembling hands. To her surprise, it opened with a creak, the hinges groaning in protest, but it gave way. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior of the house was just as eerie as the outside. The air inside was thick with dust, and the wooden floorboards creaked beneath her weight. It smelled of rot and mildew, the scent of long-neglected memories. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture, what little remained, was broken and covered in cobwebs. A grand staircase spiraled upward, but Sarah didn't have the strength to explore further. She needed to find a place to hide, to rest. Her eyes landed on a doorway at the far end of the room. It led into what appeared to be a small parlor, its fireplace dark and cold. She moved toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. As she crossed the threshold into the parlor, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A large ornate mirror, hanging on the wall opposite the fireplace. The mirror was unlike any she had ever seen. Its frame was dark and twisted, adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. It was old, ancient even, and yet it gleamed with an unnatural brightness, almost as if it had been freshly polished. For a moment, Sarah felt a strange compulsion to approach it, to see what was reflected in its glass. But as she drew closer, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, distorting her reflection. The face staring back at her was not her own. It was twisted, distorted, as though someone else was standing in her place. Her skin seemed to melt away, revealing raw, bloody muscle beneath. And her eyes were hollow, empty, just like Marcus's. She recoiled, a scream rising in her throat. But before she could turn away, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, spoke from the mirror. "Welcome." The voice was cold, ancient, and laced with malice. It sent a chill through Sarah's spine, freezing her in place. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear threatening to suffocate her. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The figure in the mirror grinned, its mouth stretching wider than humanly possible. The face was shifting, constantly changing, like 1,000 different people blended together into one grotesque form. "We are the ones who have always been here," the voice answered, its tone sending shivers down her spine. "We are the ones who made the beach what it is." Sarah felt her stomach churn as the figure in the mirror reached out toward her, its fingers stretching toward her face. She stumbled back, her mind racing. What was this? What was going on? The house, the beach, everything. It was all connected. But how? Before she could make sense of it, a sudden crash sounded from the other side of the house. It was a loud, violent noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was approaching. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew what it was. She didn't need to see it to know. It was the beach, the cursed, insidious force that had claimed Marcus and was now coming for her. It had followed her into the house, and now it was coming for her, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned toward the door. She had no time to waste. She had to escape, had to find a way out before it was too late. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room for any way out, but the house was like a maze, its rooms twisting and turning in impossible ways. And then she saw it. At the far end of the parlor, just beyond the mirror, was another door. A small wooden door that looked like it led to a basement. It was ajar, the darkness beyond it promising refuge, but at the same time, it felt like a descent into madness. But Sarah didn't care. It was the only chance she had left. She ran toward it, her hand reaching for the handle, but as she touched it, she heard a voice, soft, almost mocking, whisper from behind her. "You can't escape." The voice was everywhere, surrounding her, filling her ears with its cold, knowing tone. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the reflection of herself in the mirror, smiling back at her with that twisted, hollow grin. She grabbed the door, yanked it open, and plunged into the darkness beyond, slamming it shut behind her. The air in the basement was thick and cold, and as Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something that made her blood freeze. The basement was not just a basement, it was a graveyard. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were bones, bones of every shape and size. Human bones. The remains of the countless sacrifices that had been made to keep the beach alive, to feed the twisted power that haunted it. And there, in the center of the room, was a pedestal. Atop the pedestal rested a strange, glowing object, a small, intricately carved stone that pulsed with an eerie light. It was the source of the power, Sarah realized. It was what the beach needed, what it had been feeding on, what it had been protecting all this time. But as she stared at it, a terrible realization dawned on her. The stone was not just an object. It was alive, and it knew she was there. The whispers began again, louder now, more insistent. They came from all directions, swirling around her, pressing in on her mind. The stone was calling to her, beckoning her closer, promising her power, offering her release. But Sarah knew better now. She understood what had happened to Marcus, to the others, what the beach had done to them. The stone, the curse, it was all part of a dark pact, a never-ending cycle of sacrifice and bloodshed. And she was next. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The bones on the shelves rattled and shifted, as if something below was waking up. The stone pulsed brighter, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a deafening roar. She had to destroy it. She had to stop it before it consumed her, before it claimed her flesh and soul as it had done to so many others. With a scream, Sarah lunged toward the stone, her hand outstretched. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached toward the stone. The eerie light radiating from it seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the air around her was thick with dread. The whispers were no longer distant voices. They were inside her head, swirling like dark smoke, urging her forward, urging her to take the stone and join the curse. She hesitated, just for a moment, because deep down, she knew what it would cost. The whispers promised her power, freedom from the beach's wrath, but she understood now. There was no escape, not without sacrifice, not without becoming part of the endless cycle of horrors that had plagued this cursed shore for centuries. With a defiant roar, Sarah slammed her hand down onto the pedestal, her fingers gripping the stone's smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently, and the air grew impossibly cold. The basement seemed to shift, walls warping, stretching like they were alive. The bones rattled, the shelves groaned as though protesting her interference, but she didn't let go. The stone pulsed with a terrible energy, a dark, almost intoxicating power surging through her veins. It was as if she could feel the beach, feel the lives it had claimed, the dark forces that had fed upon them, coursing into her. For a moment her vision blurred, her body frozen as the power overwhelmed her senses. She could see the tortured souls of those who had come before her, their twisted faces pressing against the stone, begging for release. But it was too late for them. The basement seemed to collapse around her. The walls began to crack, the air filling with the sickening sound of bones snapping, of cries from the past echoing through the chamber. The whispers turned to screams, and the ground beneath her cracked open like an abyss, ready to swallow her whole. But Sarah, despite the fear, despite the pain surging through her body, held firm. She knew she had to finish it. She had to break the cycle. Her other hand shot out, fingers trembling as she grasped a sharp, jagged piece of bone from one of the shelves. She pressed it against the stone, her body protesting with every second. The whispers turned into shrieks, deafening in their intensity. The power of the stone fought back, sending waves of agony through her body. But Sarah didn't falter. With one final desperate cry, she plunged the bone into the stone. The world seemed to shudder. The stone cracked, its surface splitting as if it had been made of glass. The light from it flickered and died, the once vibrant energy fading into nothingness. For a heartbeat, everything was still, silent. Then the ground beneath her feet collapsed entirely. Sarah woke up to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. She gasped for breath, her chest heaving as though she had just been pulled from underwater. Her skin was slick with sweat, and her body ached, but she was alive. The suffocating darkness had lifted. The oppressive weight of the house, the basement, the curse, it was all gone. She lay on the sandy beach, the same beach that had haunted her dreams, that had claimed so many lives. But now, as she looked around, there was no sign of the horrors that had once existed here. The beach was calm, the sun was shining brightly overhead, and the sand beneath her hands felt warm and comforting. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the salty air, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Marcus. He was standing in front of her, looking as he had before, alive, his face full of warmth and familiarity. He extended a hand to her and she took it, her heart swelling with both relief and sorrow. They had both been through so much. They had both faced the horrors of the cursed beach. But now perhaps it was finally over. "Sarah," Marcus said softly, his voice full of emotion. "You did it. You stopped it." Sarah could only nod, her throat too tight with the weight of everything they had endured. The shadows of the beach, the memories of the past, the cursed souls, the whispers, were gone. The sacrifice had been made. The power had been broken. But the cost was high. Too high. And yet, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace now, knowing that she had freed herself and Marcus from the grip of the beach. She had destroyed the stone. She had ended the cycle. "We're free," Sarah whispered, the words finally settling into her heart. "We're free." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The beach, once cursed and twisted, now seemed alive in a different way. Quiet, still, and almost peaceful, as if it were waiting. As Sarah and Marcus stood together, gazing out over the horizon, the distant whisper of the beach seemed to fade into the wind. The curse had been broken, but there was always the possibility that something else, something new, would rise from the ashes. A part of Sarah knew this. The beach was never truly finished. The darkness, the hunger, it always found a way. But for now, at least, they were free. For now, they had survived. And as the last of the fog lifted from the shore, Sarah and Marcus walked away, the beach behind them, the world stretching ahead, a world where the shadows had finally been cast out. Story number 3. The sun had just begun its descent over the horizon, painting the sky in a cascade of rich oranges and purples as Claire and Daniel stood on the porch of the isolated beach house. The house, tucked away on the edge of a rugged coastline, was a place they had chosen to escape the noise and distractions of the world, a place to focus on each other, to reconnect. The decision to come here had not been made lightly. They'd been dating for nearly a year, their connection undeniable, and while they were deeply in love, there had always been a nagging question in the back of Claire's mind. Was it truly love, or just a fleeting infatuation? Something to keep them distracted from the deeper issues they hadn't yet faced in their own lives? But as she stood on the porch, Daniel's hand warm in hers, all doubts seemed to vanish. They were here now, and it was perfect. There were no distractions, no interruptions. Just the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks below, the scent of salt water on the wind, and the promise of uninterrupted time together. The house had an eerie charm to it, old but well-maintained, with wooden beams and large windows that let in the glow of the setting sun. It was a house that seemed to have a personality of its own, as if it had been waiting for them, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that it was too quiet, too still for something so remote. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice snapping her out of her thoughts. Claire smiled softly and nodded, squeezing his hand. "Yeah, I don't know. It feels like this place has a history." Daniel raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a teasing smile. "It's a beach house, Claire. What history could it have?" "I don't know," she said, her gaze lingering on the vast ocean beyond. "It's just something about it." The air had grown colder, and Claire wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling a chill that didn't seem to come from the wind. Daniel noticed it too, but he shrugged it off. "You've been reading too many ghost stories," he joked. "Relax. Let's go inside. It's our weekend." But as they walked into the house, Claire couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. There was something about the house. The walls seemed to be closing in on her, pressing in with a silent weight. The evening progressed uneventfully. They cooked dinner together, laughed, and shared stories about their lives before they met. As the night deepened, they settled into the living room, the warmth of the fireplace adding a cozy touch to the otherwise somber atmosphere of the house. But despite the romantic ambiance, something felt off. There was an uncomfortable energy hanging in the air. At first, it was nothing Claire could name. A distant noise, the kind of sound that was just beyond her comprehension, seemed to come from the walls. But every time she turned her head to listen, it would stop. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed unbothered, too wrapped up in the evening to notice. He kissed her gently on the lips, then pulled her closer. "It's just the house settling, nothing more." Claire nodded but remained uneasy. She felt it then, a strange compulsion, like an invisible hand pressing on her chest, urging her to give in, to let herself be carried away by the moment that had been building between them since they arrived. And though she knew it was nothing but a feeling, an intuition, she couldn't help but succumb to it. Her breath quickened as she leaned into Daniel, her fingers tugging at the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't just desire. There was something deeper, something darker. And when their lips met again, this time more urgently, Claire felt herself falling into a spiraling wave of emotions she couldn't control. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing with them, pulling them deeper into its embrace. The air felt thick, charged with electricity as their bodies entwined. Their passion seemed to transcend the moment, as though they were no longer just two people, but part of something far greater, far darker. The night was long, filled with fevered passion, as though they were possessed by something beyond their control. The world outside the house had ceased to exist. Claire and Daniel's connection had deepened into something strange and intoxicating, an urge to merge, to lose themselves in one another completely. But when the dawn finally came, the air seemed to shift. Claire awoke with a jolt, her breath ragged, as though she had been running for hours. Her body was sore, and her mind was clouded. She turned to find Daniel beside her, his face expressionless, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as though in a trance. "Daniel?" she whispered, shaking him gently. "Daniel, wake up." His eyes slowly focused on her, but there was something wrong in his gaze, something distant, as though he were no longer entirely present. "Did you hear that?" he asked softly, his voice hollow. Claire blinked. "Hear what?" "The whispers," Daniel replied, his voice now filled with a strange urgency. "They were calling to me, and there was something pulling me toward the sea." Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat. She could feel it now too, the same pull, the same unnatural pressure in the air. And then, as if it had been waiting for them, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the house like a distant chant, a faint but unmistakable presence. It was as though they were no longer alone. As the day wore on, the couple's unease deepened. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the house, seeming to come from every corner. At night, strange, inexplicable events began to occur. Items moved on their own, the lights flickered, and Claire could no longer shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the dead of night, when sleep had eluded them both, they ventured into the attic, where they found old, dusty records of the house's history. Old photographs and documents that spoke of a tragedy from many decades ago. The house had once belonged to a wealthy couple, John and Evelyn. They had lived in the house many years before, but their love had been twisted into something tragic. Desperate to keep their love eternal, they made a pact with dark forces to bind their spirits to the house. The curse, however, had gone horribly wrong, and in their attempt to secure their love, they died in agony, their souls unable to move on. As Claire and Daniel pieced together the story, they realized with growing horror that they were being drawn into the same trap. The spirits of John and Evelyn had awakened within them, their unresolved passions and violence bleeding through their actions. They were no longer in control. As the days passed, Claire and Daniel found themselves spiraling into madness. Their connection, once full of love and joy, had become twisted, their emotions distorted. The spirits of John and Evelyn used their bodies as vessels to experience the desires, the pain, the violence they had felt in their previous lives. Every time they succumbed to the overwhelming passion, they were pulled deeper into the cycle, unable to stop, unable to escape. The house became a prison, and they were its unwilling inhabitants, trapped in a never-ending loop of torment. They fought against it, but it was no use. The house had them, and the spirit's power over them grew stronger with each passing day. In the end, Claire and Daniel realized the horrifying truth. They were the new sunken lovers. Their souls were now bound to the house, doomed to repeat the cycle of violence and torment forever, just as John and Evelyn had done. The days blurred together, each one merging into the next with an unrelenting sense of dread. Claire and Daniel, once so full of life and energy, now moved through the house as if in a fog. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. They were no longer able to tell where their desires ended and the spirits began. It was as though they were puppets, strings pulled by invisible hands, bound to a tragic fate they had not chosen. Claire found herself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was not the same person who had arrived at the house a few days ago. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality. She had lost weight, and the lines of worry on her face had deepened. But it wasn't just the physical changes. It was the emptiness in her gaze, the vacancy that had replaced the woman who had once been full of life and love. The whispers came again, soft, unintelligible murmurs, growing louder by the second. Claire clenched her fists, fighting the urge to answer them, to give in to the pull. "Stop," she whispered to herself. her voice trembling. But the pull was irresistible. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open. Daniel's figure appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with the same haunted expression she had seen in the mirror just moments before. His hand was outstretched, fingers twitching as if drawn by some invisible force. "Claire," he whispered, his voice distant. "We have to go to the beach." Claire turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What? What do you mean? We can't—" But he wasn't listening. He was already moving toward her, his body stiff, his steps slow but purposeful. The whispers filled her ears again, and before she knew it, Claire found herself walking alongside him, her body moving as though controlled by some external force. Outside, the night had fallen, and the beach stretched out before them, a vast, empty expanse of sand and sea. The waves crashed violently against the shore, the moon casting an eerie glow over the water. It was the same beach they had arrived on, but it felt different now, as though the land itself had shifted, changed in some fundamental way. Daniel's hand gripped hers tightly, and together they walked toward the water, the sand beneath their feet cold and unforgiving. Claire could feel the pull of the ocean, a deep, gnawing sensation that seemed to call her name, beckoning her closer to the dark abyss. The whispers grew louder, and Claire began to hear them more clearly now. They were no longer random phrases, but distinct words, pleas for help, desperate cries of pain and sorrow. Her legs felt heavy, as if the sand beneath her was sucking her down, pulling her toward something dark, something ancient. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow, his eyes wide with fear. "I hear it," Claire whispered back, her voice shaking. "It's them, the lovers. They're speaking to us." Before she could say anything more, a gust of wind howled through the night, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. The water churned violently, rising and crashing against the shore with a ferocity that sent a shiver through her bones. It was as if the entire world was shifting, as if the earth beneath them was reacting to their presence, to the presence of the spirits that haunted the land. And then, as though it had been waiting for them, the ground beneath their feet gave way. Claire and Daniel tumbled into the sand, their bodies crashing into the earth with a sickening thud. The sand swirled around them like a storm, and the world seemed to spin. When Claire regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the cold beach, her body soaked with seawater. The whispers had stopped. Everything was silent, deathly silent. But when she looked up, she saw the figures standing before them, two ghostly forms, translucent and shimmering in the moonlight. The man was tall, his features sharp and angular, his eyes burning with a cold, vengeful fire. The woman was smaller, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a chill down Claire's spine. They were John and Evelyn, the sunken lovers. John and Evelyn's eyes locked onto Claire and Daniel, their expressions unreadable, but their intentions clear. The air around them crackled with an otherworldly energy, a force so powerful it seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Claire tried to move, but her body refused to obey. She could feel the invisible strings tightening, pulling her toward them. Her vision blurred, and the world around her spun again. The whispers returned, now louder, more forceful, as if the spirits were screaming at her, urging her to surrender. "Help us," Evelyn's voice came, a low, hollow whisper, though her lips did not move. It was as though the words were carved into Claire's mind, a psychic intrusion she could not escape. Daniel's hand was still clutched tightly in hers, but it felt wrong now. Cold, lifeless. "Why?" Claire managed to gasp, her voice trembling with fear. "Because you are us now?" John said, his voice resonating in the air like a thunderclap. "You have awakened us, and now you must take our place. You will live our lives, repeat our mistakes, and suffer as we did." Claire's heart skipped a beat. The truth crashed down on her like a wave. John and Evelyn had been trapped in a cycle. Their love twisted into something destructive and violent, binding their souls to the house, to the beach, forever. Now they were going to make Claire and Daniel their vessels, trapping them in the same eternal cycle of torment and lust. The air around Claire seemed to pulse, and suddenly, her body felt like it wasn't her own. She felt a searing pain in her chest, a burning sensation that spread through her limbs like wildfire. It was as though her very soul was being torn from her body, replaced by something else. She looked at Daniel, his face contorted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. He too was changing. His features were twisting, his expression becoming one of pure anguish. The spirits had taken control. "Let go," Evelyn whispered, her voice now a soft lullaby. "Let it happen. You cannot fight it." And Claire did not want to fight it anymore. She could feel herself slipping, the last threads of her identity unraveling. Her heart, her mind, her very will was being consumed by the presence of the spirits, and for a moment, it felt as though she was floating outside her body, a mere observer of the horrors unfolding before her. But then, as if from a deep instinctual place within her, Claire screamed. She screamed for herself. She screamed for Daniel. She screamed for the lives they had lost, for the love they had shared, for the souls that had been stolen from them. But it was too late. John and Evelyn were inside them now, and their love, their twisted, vengeful love, was all that remained. The sun began to rise once again, casting its pale light over the beach. But there was no peace, no relief. The couple, now bound to the spirits of John and Evelyn, could not escape the cycle that had been set in motion. As the days passed, Claire and Daniel's bodies moved mechanically, as though they were merely shells, worn vessels for the spirits' unquenchable thirst for revenge. They would walk the beach, lost in the whispers, always drawn to the ocean, always compelled to repeat the same tragic events. They were now the sunken lovers, bound to the beach, doomed to repeat the cycle of violence and passion that had destroyed those who came before them. And the whispers, they would never stop. Claire's body moved as though it were not her own. She felt a coldness within her, an absence of life, as though her very soul had been shattered, replaced by something darker. Each time her feet sank into the sand, she felt it, an overwhelming pull toward the ocean, as though the waves themselves were calling her, drawing her into their depths. She could not escape. Daniel walked beside her, his eyes empty, his body just as cold and lifeless as hers. His once vibrant personality was gone, replaced by the ghostly presence of John, who had taken root within him, twisting his thoughts, desires, and actions. The same happened to Claire. Evelyn's spirit had burrowed deep inside her, a parasite feeding off her mind, her emotions, her will to live. They would stand on the shore for hours, staring at the water, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun never seemed to rise or set. The beach was suspended in time, trapped in a perpetual twilight, where nothing felt real anymore. Only the whispers, the constant pull toward the water, the violent desires that rose up within them. It was all that remained. Claire's hands shook as she reached toward the water, her fingertips brushing against the cold, frothy waves. She was pulled deeper, but her body was paralyzed, trapped in the moment. Her mind screamed, but Evelyn's voice drowned out her cries. It was as though the spirit was inside her, taking control, pushing her to feel the same hunger, the same unholy lust that had consumed the lost lovers so long ago. She could hear Evelyn's voice now, sweet and seductive in her ear, a whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Embrace it, Claire," Evelyn's voice purred. "We are one now, you and I. You cannot escape what we are." Claire felt tears stinging her eyes, but she couldn't cry, couldn't mourn for herself. Her emotions were no longer her own. They belonged to Evelyn now. Daniel's transformation had been just as complete. He moved through the motions of their existence, a puppet controlled by John's ghost. He no longer saw Claire as his lover, but as a vessel, a tool to fulfill the spirit's twisted desires. Every word that left his lips now seemed foreign, detached from the man he once was. "We were meant to be together forever, Claire," Daniel said one evening, his voice devoid of warmth. "We are bound, our fates are sealed, and so are yours." His words echoed through the hollow air like a chant, his eyes reflecting a cold, distant hunger. "But we were supposed to be happy," Claire managed to say, though the words felt foreign to her own tongue. "We were supposed to be free, to live." "Free?" Daniel laughed, but it wasn't his laugh. It was a hollow, haunting sound that sent a chill through Claire's bones. "We were never free, Claire. We were always trapped, just like them." "Them," Claire echoed, realizing with horror who he meant. John and Evelyn, bound to the beach, to their love, to their vengeance, forever. "We'll never escape," Daniel continued, his gaze intense. "They live through us now. We are them. This is the price we paid for awakening them." Claire staggered back, her mind swirling in a frenzy of panic. The truth hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She had thought it was just a haunting, just a tragedy. But now she understood. This was a curse. They were the new victims, and there was no escape. "Please," Claire begged, her voice breaking. "We can still fight. We can still leave. We can—" But Daniel turned away, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean stretched endlessly. He spoke with the voice of John now, the words cutting into Claire like a knife. "There is no fighting. There is only eternity." Night after night, Claire and Daniel drifted deeper into the madness. The spirits had taken over their lives, their very souls, and every day felt like a repetition of the last. There were moments, brief moments, when Claire felt herself slipping back, when she could see the person she once was. But these moments were fleeting, vanishing as quickly as they came, drowned by the relentless pull of the spirits. The house they had once called home felt like a prison now. The walls seemed to close in around them, the floorboards creaking with the weight of the past, of the ghosts that walked with them in every room, in every corner. The house groaned under the strain of its own secrets, and always, they were drawn back to the beach, to the spot where they had first awakened the spirits. It was as if the very land itself was calling to them, pulling them toward the water, toward the darkness that lay beneath the waves. One night, Claire could no longer resist. The whispers had become deafening, their voices like a chorus of mournful wails in her ears, driving her mad. She stood at the edge of the water, staring at the blackened depths, and for the first time since their arrival, she understood the terrible truth. The ocean was a grave, a dark abyss that consumed everything in its path. It was the resting place of souls who had been torn apart, their bodies shattered, their minds lost to time. John and Evelyn had drowned in that very water, and their souls had never been allowed to rest. They had been trapped, just as Claire and Daniel were now trapped. She turned toward Daniel, her eyes wild with terror and desperation. "We have to end it," she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. "We can't keep living like this. We can't keep hurting each other." But Daniel was already gone. His body had already been claimed by John's spirit, and when he looked at her now, his eyes were nothing but an empty reflection of the man he had once been. "There is no ending, Claire," Daniel's voice, now cold and detached, echoed. "Only the beginning. We will keep coming back, again and again. We are the sunken lovers, doomed to repeat our love, our violence forever." As the days passed, the weight of their cursed existence grew heavier. Every time Claire thought she might break free, the spirit's grip tightened, pulling her back into the endless cycle of torment. She and Daniel would relive their passion, their pain, the tragic love story of John and Evelyn over and over again. The house had become a tomb, a hollow shell that echoed with the sounds of lost souls. The beach had become their prison, the water its eternal keeper. And Claire and Daniel were not the only ones trapped here. The spirits of John and Evelyn would forever linger, whispering their desires, their pain, their need for vengeance into the ears of those who came to the beach. And so, the cycle continued. New victims would arrive, unaware of the fate that awaited them, and they too would become part of the story. The endless tale of the sunken lovers. No one would ever leave. The days bled into one another as Claire and Daniel remained prisoners of the curse, locked in a spiraling web of violent desire and sorrow. The beach house, which once held the promise of escape, now felt like the heart of their torment. It stood as a monument to the endless cycle of love, death, and vengeance that had consumed them, and would continue to consume anyone who dared to come too close. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ocean, as Claire stood at the water's edge, her eyes staring into the abyss. Her thoughts were fragmented, the ghosts of Evelyn and John constantly whispering in her ears. They had filled her with their insatiable hunger, their despair. They had broken her spirit, leaving her a hollow shell of the person she had once been. She could feel Daniel's presence behind her, but it wasn't him anymore. Not truly. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by John, the restless spirit that now controlled his body, his every move. His voice still held the echo of their past, but there was no humanity left in it. Just a hollow, unfeeling vessel for the ghost of a man who had never known peace. Claire, Daniel's voice, John's voice, whispered from behind her. His hand reached for her shoulder, his fingers cold, his touch like ice. It's time to join us. We are eternal now. She shuddered but didn't pull away. She was numb. She had stopped fighting long ago. The curse had rooted so deeply in her. She wasn't sure where the spirits ended, and she began. She was no longer Claire. She had become part of their tragedy, part of their never-ending cycle. The sky above began to crack with an unnatural darkness, the clouds swirling, gathering as if the heavens themselves were drawn into the horror of the curse. The ocean churned, waves crashing violently against the shore, each one a reminder of the lives lost to the water. The spirits had grown stronger, their hunger insatiable, and now they were calling for their final sacrifice. The souls of Claire and Daniel, bound together in eternal torment. Claire turned toward him, her eyes devoid of all emotion. Is this all we are now? Is this all we will ever be? Trapped in this cycle, repeating the same mistake, the same violence over and over? Yes, Daniel replied, his voice filled with a cold certainty. This is who we are. This is what we've become. We are the sunken lovers. There is no escaping it. Claire felt a tremor in her chest, a fleeting pulse of defiance, but it was quickly smothered by the overwhelming presence of the spirits. They surged within her, their desires pushing her forward, pulling her back into their endless loop. She could feel herself slipping, the last remnants of her own will disintegrating into the void. A single tear slid down her cheek. It was not for herself, but for what they had lost, what they had become. The life they could have shared, the love they could have known, was all gone. All because of a love that had never been allowed to die. Then in a moment of clarity, Claire heard the sound of water, the relentless pull of the ocean, growing louder. The tide was rising, the beach turning into a grave, ready to claim its final victims. She closed her eyes and took one last breath, feeling the spirit surge around her, the coldness seeping into her soul. Let it end, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. Daniel's arms wrapped around her, his grip as cold and unyielding as death itself. She felt the sharp pull of the water, the weight of the spirits dragging them both toward the ocean. Their bodies moved of their own accord, drawn to the water's edge like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. And as the waves rose, swallowing them whole, Claire felt herself surrender. The cycle was complete. There was no more resistance. no more fight. She embraced the darkness, the cold, the endless cycle of love, lust, and death. As their bodies sank into the depths of the ocean, Claire felt her soul dissolve into the water, merging with the spirits of Evelyn and John. The beach, the house, the curse. It all faded into nothingness. They were no longer bound to the earth, no longer trapped by the land. They had become part of the ocean, part of the eternal cycle of love and torment that would never end. Years passed, and the beach remained untouched, hidden away from the world. Those who ventured too close to the cursed shore spoke of strange occurrences. Faint whispers in the wind, cold winds that seemed to emanate from the water itself, and the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. No one who came near the beach stayed for long. The land had become a warning, a place of death and sorrow, where the spirits of the sunken lovers would forever linger. And for those who dared to listen closely enough, they could hear the echoes of Claire and Daniel's voices, mingled with the whispers of John and Evelyn. The curse was not over. It would never be over. The sunken lovers would wait. Forever. Story number 4. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the pristine stretch of sand. The ocean's waves lapped gently against the shore, their rhythmic sound soothing, almost hypnotic. The air was warm and thick with the scent of salt and tropical flowers. From a distance, the beach looked like paradise, an untouched slice of heaven far from the bustling world. The exclusive beach resort had been advertised as the perfect escape. Situated on a secluded island, it promised its guests total privacy, endless luxury, and the kind of pleasure that only the finest destinations could offer. For most people, it would be a dream come true, an opportunity to unwind and indulge in their desires without a single care in the world. It was everything its website had promised and more. As the resort's shuttle boat glided toward the dock, the passengers marveled at the beauty of the coastline, their eyes drinking in the untouched greenery, the towering cliffs, and the sparkling ocean that stretched to infinity. Among them was Emma and Alex, a young couple eager to start their honeymoon. Their excitement was palpable as they exchanged glances, their minds filled with visions of luxury spas, candlelit dinners, and private beaches where they could bask in the sun and surrender to their passions. The resort manager, a tall, composed woman named Isabel, greeted them with a warm smile as they disembarked from the boat. She wore a crisp white linen dress that fluttered in the gentle breeze, her silver hair swept back elegantly. Her eyes, however, carried an unreadable depth, a sharpness that felt out of place in such a serene setting. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth like velvet. "I trust you'll find everything to your liking. Our facilities have been designed to cater to every indulgence." Emma and Alex exchanged a glance, excited by the promise of a carefree escape. Isabel led them along the beach toward the resort's main building. The luxurious rooms, the expansive pool, the outdoor terraces, they were all designed to evoke a sense of peace, to envelop the guests in a world where they could forget about everything but their desires. "Here at the resort," Isabel continued, "we specialize in catering to your every wish. Whatever your heart desires, it is ours to provide." Emma smiled. "Sounds like exactly what we need." Isabel's smile didn't waver, but there was a glimmer of something darker in her eyes. "And we do ask that you trust us. In return, we'll ensure that your stay is unforgettable." As Isabel led them to their room, Alex found himself distracted by the strange feeling that had begun to creep over him. There was something about the way Isabel spoke, something that felt off, as if her words were carefully chosen, measured. He shook it off, dismissing it as excitement for their honeymoon. The room they were shown to was an elegant suite with an ocean view, A king-sized bed draped in soft white linen sat in the center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the horizon perfectly. The air inside the room was cool and inviting, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. "You'll find everything you need right here," Isabel said, her tone almost too reassuring. "There's a private path that leads directly to the beach. The ocean will be your sanctuary." Once Isabel left, Emma and Alex shared a lingering kiss. They dropped their luggage by the door and made their way out onto the terrace, eager to take in the view. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was louder now, almost hypnotic. They could see the beach stretching endlessly, an inviting expanse of soft golden sand. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. "This place is perfect," Alex said, his voice full of awe. Emma nodded, slipping her arms around his neck. "It's everything we've dreamed of. Just you, me, and the ocean." They were alone. The world seemed distant, forgotten. The pull of the beach was undeniable, its promise of intimacy and indulgence beckoning them closer. They walked down the stone steps, their bare feet sinking into the warm sand. Emma reached for Alex's hand, her fingers entwining with his. Together they walked toward the water. As they approached the edge, a strange sensation washed over them. It wasn't fear, nor was it discomfort. It was something more primal, something seductive, almost intoxicating. The ocean seemed to call to them, its depths beckoning. Emma shivered slightly as the waves kissed her feet. She looked out across the water, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw something beneath the surface, something moving, something watching. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alex turned to look, his brow furrowing. "See what?" She shook her head, dismissing it. "I don't know. I thought I saw something in the water. Never mind." The waves continued to roll in, their sound growing louder, more insistent. The sensation of being watched only intensified, and Emma felt a sudden unease. She tried to shake it off, but the pull of the ocean was stronger now, overwhelming. "Let's go for a swim," Alex suggested, a mischievous grin crossing his face. "The water looks amazing." Emma hesitated for a moment, but the allure of the beach was too strong. She nodded, giving in. "Okay, let's do it." They waded deeper into the water, the coolness of it sending a shiver down Emma's spine. The moment they were fully submerged, the water seemed to embrace them, to pull them in. It was exhilarating at first, the waves lifting them, carrying them away from the shore. But then, something shifted. Emma felt a strange pressure on her chest, as if the ocean was pushing against her. She turned to look at Alex, but his expression had changed. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and he was no longer looking at her. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the horizon, his body stiff and unmoving. "Alex?" Emma called out, but her voice was swallowed by the roaring waves. She reached for him, but he was unreachable, as if the ocean had claimed him, pulling him deeper. Then she heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It was low and guttural, like a whisper coming from the depths of the sea. Her heart raced as she realized it wasn't Alex speaking. "Come closer." The voice was seductive yet chilling. Emma's limbs felt heavy, as if the ocean was holding her in place. The pull to move forward was overwhelming, and she found herself drawn to the water, deeper and deeper. "Come closer, and your desires will be fulfilled." But as the waves rose around her, she saw it. The shadow beneath the surface, moving toward her. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something dark. The creature was long, its body twisted and contorted, with glowing eyes that pierced through the water. And then, she understood. The beach wasn't just a paradise. It was a trap. The ocean, the waves, the very resort itself, it was feeding off them. The pleasures it offered were not for free. They came at a cost. And now, The beach was ready to claim its prize. The coolness of the ocean had felt invigorating at first, but now, with the waves tugging at her, Emma could barely move. The water rose around her, cold and slick, its pull insistent. Every time she attempted to break free, the ocean seemed to pull her back deeper into its grasp. She tried to call out for Alex, but her voice was swallowed by the sea's roaring thunder. She felt the pressure build against her chest, not the weight of the water, but something more, an invisible force that seemed to be pulling at her very soul. She fought against it, thrashing in the waves, but it was no use. She was sinking. Her limbs were growing heavy, her thoughts clouded. And then, just as the darkness of the water began to overtake her, a hand grabbed hers, yanking her upward. The cold air hit her like a shock as she was pulled from the water and onto solid ground. "Emma!" Alex's voice broke through the fog of her confusion, his tone frantic. She blinked, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the cold and the sensation of the ocean's hunger. She tried to speak, to say something, but all she could do was stare at Alex, his face pale, eyes wide, like someone had just ripped him from a nightmare. "What happened?" he whispered, pulling her tightly into his arms. Emma struggled to find her words, but her mind was clouded with fragments of visions. Whispers in the water, shadows beneath the surface, and an ancient voice that had called to her. "The water," she gasped, shuddering. "Alex, the water. It's not just the ocean. There's something down there. Something evil." Alex looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Emma, you're just..." But then, his eyes glazed over. For a moment, Emma swore she saw something dark shift in his pupils. He blinked, shaking his head, as if trying to shake off a fog that had settled there. He looked at her again, this time with a strange intensity, his lips curling into a smile that didn't seem to belong to him. "We need to go back inside," he said, his voice softer now, almost seductive. "The night is waiting for us, Emma. Let the water wash it all away." But something in his voice, the way he spoke, made her feel uneasy. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, and she could feel the pull of the ocean, still tugging at her, still wanting her to return. "No, we need to leave," Emma insisted, her voice shaking. "I don't want to stay here. Something's wrong. The beach, it's not just beautiful, it's alive, and it's calling us." Alex's expression shifted again, his eyes narrowing, the smile fading. He stepped toward her, his fingers brushing against her arm in a way that sent an electric shock through her skin. "Emma, you're just tired. You're imagining things. The resort is a sanctuary. We're safe here." But Emma could see it now, the glimmer of something else in his eyes. A hunger, a need. It wasn't like the Alex she knew. It was something darker, something foreign. She recoiled, instinctively pulling back, but Alex grabbed her wrist, his grip tight and unyielding. "Come with me," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. "I promise you, this will all make sense. Let go, Emma. Let yourself feel." Something inside Emma screamed. This wasn't her Alex. This was something else, something that the beach had claimed, something that the ocean had drawn from the depths. But the pull was undeniable. The air around her seemed to hum with a dark energy, and Emma found herself leaning closer to Alex, her body betraying her as it responded to him in ways that felt wrong, yet irresistibly right. Before she could stop herself, they were walking back to their room, her legs moving almost on their own, drawn by the same force that had taken hold of Alex. The room, when they entered, was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long across the floor as if the very walls were closing in around them. Alex closed the door behind them with a quiet click, his movements slow and deliberate. Emma's heart raced, her thoughts in chaos. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body felt heavy, like it was being guided by some unseen force. "Emma," Alex whispered, stepping closer. His breath was hot against her ear. You felt it too, haven't you? The pull, the desire. The ocean wants us, just like it wants everyone. Emma tried to pull away, but her body was no longer hers to control. The energy in the room, the oppressive heat, filled her senses and drowned out her will. Alex's lips met hers, and in that moment, everything she had feared, the pull of the water, the strange presence in the air, the whispers, flooded back, overpowering her. She kissed him back helplessly, the world around them spinning, spiraling. But as she surrendered to the sensation, she felt something shift. Something inside her that wasn't Alex, wasn't even her own desire, took over. Her body was no longer her own. It was as if someone else was guiding her, feeding off her passion, using her to fulfill their own twisted desires. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Emma gasped, breaking away from Alex's kiss. She looked into his eyes, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. His pupils were completely dilated, black as the night. His lips twisted into a smile, one that was no longer warm or loving. It was cruel, hollow. Do you see it now? He murmured, his voice low and husky. It's here, Emma. The beach, the water. It wants us. It's feeding on us, and we're feeding it in return. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Alex, no, this isn't you. But the words died on her lips as a dark shadow seemed to rise from the floor, swirling around them. It was the ocean, the water. They could feel it now, creeping through the walls, through the floorboards. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself had become a part of the ocean, pulling them deeper into its grip. Alex's hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat, his strength no longer human. We're trapped here now, Emma. We were always meant to be part of it. The water doesn't let you leave once it has claimed you. Emma struggled to breathe, the pressure on her throat constricting. Her vision blurred, the room spinning as if it were sinking beneath the waves. Just as everything seemed to fade into darkness, she heard the whisper again, the voice from the ocean, cold and malevolent. Come closer. Feed me. Become one with the tide. And then everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Emma's chest heaved as she struggled to breathe, her lungs constricting as the pressure around her neck eased just enough to keep her from slipping into unconsciousness. Her vision was blurry, a dizzying mix of shadows and flickering lights. She could hear Alex's ragged breathing, close but distant, as if he were no longer fully present in the room. Her hands scrambled at her throat, trying to pull away the invisible force that seemed to be tightening around her. With all her strength, she managed to free herself from the oppressive grip, gasping for air as she stumbled backward. Her legs were weak, but she forced herself to stand, heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Alex! Alex, please! She whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Alex stood motionless, his back turned to her, as if he were unaware of her distress. His shoulders heaved with each breath, but his movements were slow, deliberate. He was not the man she knew, the man she loved. Something had taken hold of him, something much darker. Alex! Emma's voice broke the silence, sharp and desperate. But when he turned toward her, the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. His eyes were black, completely black. Emma? His voice was not his own. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with an unsettling resonance that sent shivers down her spine. You should have listened. Alex, please. This isn't you, she cried, taking a step back, her legs trembling beneath her. Something's wrong. You have to fight it. We need to leave. Now. But the man standing before her was no longer Alex. Whatever force had claimed him had twisted him into something unrecognizable. His lips curled into a smile, unnaturally wide, as if stretching beyond the limits of his face. You don't understand, Emma, he said softly, each word dripping with a strange, otherworldly calm. This place, it's part of us now, the water. It has chosen us. The room felt colder, the air heavier. Emma's pulse raced as she tried to comprehend what Alex was saying. The water? The ocean? Was it controlling him? Drawing him in? Suddenly, Alex lurched forward, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist with an unnerving force. She gasped as his grip tightened, and he dragged her closer to him, his face only inches from hers. "You should have embraced it, Emma," he murmured. "The hunger, the power, it's what the beach offers. All you had to do was accept it." "No!" Emma screamed, panic rising in her chest. "Let me go! Please let me go!" But his grip didn't loosen. Instead, his fingers seemed to grow colder, the skin of his hand almost clammy and damp, as if water itself had infiltrated his being. Then, with a sudden, jolting movement, he let go, pushing her away with a force that sent her stumbling backward. Emma crashed against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she scrambled to her feet. "Run, Emma! Run while you still can!" His voice was colder now, empty of any warmth. "The tide is coming, and it will claim you just like it's claimed me." Emma didn't need to hear more. She turned and bolted for the door, heart hammering in her chest. She could hear Alex's footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare look back. She reached the door and threw it open, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. The beach stretched out before her, moonlit and serene, but there was something about it now that felt suffocating, ominous. The ocean, once inviting, now seemed like a dark maw, its waves whispering promises of something far worse than she had ever imagined. As she ran toward the shoreline, the pull of the water felt stronger, as if the beach itself was reaching for her, calling her to return. "Emma!" Alex's voice broke through the night, low and menacing. "You can't run from this. We're bound to it." But she couldn't stop. She had to escape. She had to fight the pull that was dragging at her, clawing at her soul. The sand beneath her feet shifted as she ran, the familiar path to the beach house now feeling like a maze, disorienting and endless. It was as if the land itself had changed, become something unfamiliar, something hostile. The ocean's whispers grew louder, the waves crashing against the shore like thunder, echoing in her mind. She could feel it now, the hunger in the water, the insatiable need that it sought to fulfill. It was the same force that had claimed Alex, and it was calling to her too. She reached the edge of the water, the waves lapping at her ankles, and she hesitated. The chill of the ocean seeped through her clothes, but it was more than just cold. It was as if the water itself was trying to pull her in. "Come closer, Emma," a voice whispered, but it wasn't Alex's voice. It was softer, smoother, filled with a twisted sense of longing. "We will make you whole. Let the ocean feed on you. Let it take you." Emma's breath hitched. She recognized the voice now. It was the same voice she had heard before, from deep beneath the waves, the same presence that had lured her into the water. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't. I won't let you take me." But as she tried to step away, the water surged forward, the tide rising faster than it should have. It crashed over her legs, pulling her deeper into the ocean. The waves clawed at her, pulling her under, and for a brief moment, she thought she might drown. But she fought, pushing against the water with every ounce of strength she had left. "Help!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the sea. She could feel the presence now, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just the water. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, for them. And it was ready to claim its prize. As the water rose higher, she felt a coldness settle in her bones, a growing darkness in her mind. She tried to fight, tried to escape, but the more she struggled, the stronger the pull became. And then, just as she thought she couldn't fight it anymore, she saw a shape in the distance. Alex. His form loomed on the shoreline, but he wasn't alone. The figure of a woman stood beside him, her form translucent and glowing, like a ghostly wraith. "Emma?" Alex's voice drifted across the water, distant but clear. It's too late. You belong to the beach now. You belong to the tide. Terror gripped her chest as the realization hit. She wasn't just fighting to escape. She was being drawn into something much darker, much older than she had ever imagined. And as the waves pulled her under, her scream was drowned by the sound of the ocean, its hunger unquenchable. Emma's world spun wildly as she was submerged beneath the waves, the cold salt water rushing into her lungs, choking her, drowning her. But there was no escape. Not now. The pull was too strong, the water too thick, as if it were alive, feeding on her fear, pulling her down into its depths. She struggled, hands flailing in the inky blackness, desperate for air. Her eyes stung, and the sound of her frantic breathing was muffled by the rush of the tide. But through the disorienting swirl of water, she heard something otherworldly. It was a voice, soft and coaxing, like a lullaby sung from the abyss. "Come to us, Emma." The voice was so familiar, yet not. She tried to focus, to shake off the dizziness, but the deeper she sank, the more it seemed to envelop her. The words wrapped around her like a noose, pulling her deeper into the shadowed world below. "The tide has claimed you. You are ours now." She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The water swallowed her, dragging her further beneath the surface. She could feel her strength slipping away, her body growing heavier with each passing second. The weight of the ocean pressed against her, suffocating her. But it wasn't just the water. It was the presence, the entity that lurked beneath, feeding on her life force. Her hands, numb and stiff from the cold, brushed against something solid. She instinctively grasped at it, her fingers tightening around the surface. It felt rough, uneven, like stone, ancient stone. And yet it was as if it were alive, pulsating beneath her touch. "Let go, Emma," the voice whispered again, this time in a mocking tone. "You are meant for us." Her heart raced. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Suddenly a hand shot out from the shadows beneath her, grabbing her arm with cold, unyielding fingers. The grip was terrifying, impossible. She gasped as the hand pulled her down further, dragging her into a dark cavern, its walls slick and clammy with the ocean's chill. A flicker of light danced in the distance. It was faint, but it was there. A faint glow from somewhere deep within the cavern, pulling her toward it. She resisted the pull, but the more she fought, the harder the force became. It wasn't just the water. It was the spirits, the souls that had been bound to this place, bound to the sea, forever. As she was pulled into the cavern, Emma's eyes adjusted to the dim light. What she saw made her stomach churn. A stone altar stood in the center of the chamber, covered in moss and seaweed, but its shape was unmistakable. It was ancient, older than anything she had ever seen, as if it had been carved out of the ocean floor itself. And surrounding the altar were shadows, shapes that twisted and writhed in the darkness, their forms barely visible in the dim glow. The cold fingers released her, and she was thrown roughly onto the stone, her body slamming against its jagged surface. Her breath came in sharp gasps, the salt water still burning in her lungs, but she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The voices grew louder, their whispers growing into a chorus of madness, echoing off the cavern walls. The presence was all around her now, filling her mind, her senses. It was suffocating, maddening. And then, from the shadows, she saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their forms flickering like firelight. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. They were the spirits, the ones who had once been alive, but whose love had twisted into something monstrous, something unnatural. The man and woman stepped forward, their eyes dark and hollow, their bodies translucent and ethereal. Their movements were fluid, like water itself, and they reached out to her with hands that seemed to melt into the shadows. "You will join us, Emma." The woman's voice came, soft and sweet, but filled with an underlying hunger. Together, we will be complete again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the two spirits approached. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. Her body felt numb, frozen in place by the sheer terror that gripped her. Their eyes, dark and bottomless, seemed to pierce her very soul. Suddenly, she felt the cold touch of the woman's hand on her face. Her skin tingled where it made contact, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. "We were once bound by love, but now we are bound by the sea," the man whispered, his voice like gravel as he reached for her arm. "You will be our vessel, Emma. Our love will live through you." The coldness of their touch seeped into her bones, and Emma's mind seemed to fracture. Her body was no longer her own. She felt herself slipping away, her will fading as the spirits began to take over. "No, please." She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the overwhelming rush of sensation. And then, in a flash, she saw him. Alex. His figure stood at the edge of the altar, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes still black and soulless. The darkness inside him had consumed him completely. The connection between them, once strong and vibrant, had been severed, replaced by an abyss of hollow emptiness. "Alex. No," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. The spirits, the man and woman, seemed to respond to her desperation, their forms flickering. They turned toward Alex, their mouths curling into smiles that sent waves of icy terror through Emma's heart. "You cannot save him," the woman whispered, her voice like the sound of the crashing waves. "He is ours, just as you will be." Alex's figure seemed to fade, his image blurring and distorting like a mirage in the shifting shadows of the cavern. Emma felt the last threads of her strength slip away as the spirits took full control, their possession overwhelming her senses. She was lost now, lost to the depths of the ocean, lost to the love that had twisted into madness, lost to the hunger that would never be satisfied. And as the waves crashed against the stone, filling the cavern with a deafening roar, Emma's soul became one with the spirits of the beach of eternal hunger. The cavern was silent now, save for the gentle lapping of the waves against the stone walls. Emma could feel nothing but coldness, an unyielding chill that seeped into every corner of her being. Her vision was hazy, clouded by the heavy, suffocating fog of despair that filled her mind. The spirits had claimed her body, twisting it into a vessel for their eternal hunger. Her thoughts felt distant, like memories from a life she no longer recognized. The woman's voice, low and mournful, whispered in her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "You are ours now, Emma. Forever." Her body no longer obeyed her commands. It moved on its own, her limbs jerking involuntarily as if pulled by invisible strings. She could feel the presence of the spirits within her, like shadows entwining around her soul, suffocating her every thought. The hunger, the lust, it was all consuming. It tore at her from the inside, demanding release. She tried to fight it, but the more she resisted, the more their power intensified. Their desires were now hers. Their grief was now hers. Their lust was now hers. But deep within the fog of possession, a single fleeting thought sparked. One memory of Alex. The way he had once held her. The tenderness that had existed between them. Could that connection be restored? Was there a way to fight back? Her mind latched onto that memory, desperate to hold on to the fragments of who she once was. But as the thought lingered, she saw him again, the man she had once loved, his hollow eyes staring back at her from the depths of the ocean. He was nothing but a puppet now, just as she had become. A hollow shell controlled by the spirits of the lovers. There was no escape. The beach, the ocean, the curse. It consumed everything in its path. The stone altar beneath her vibrated, its ancient power pulsing through the cavern. She could feel it now, the dark energy swirling around her, pushing her toward the inevitable. She had been chosen, marked by the beach, and there was no turning back. But then, a voice, her own voice, but different, distorted, echoed in the chamber. No. And then, louder still. I will not be a part of this. I will not be a vessel for your hunger. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emma focused on that one thought, the memory of love, of a time before the curse had taken over her. She fought the possession with everything she had, pushing against the cold, dark force that gripped her soul. For the first time, the spirits faltered. Their grip loosened, and the agony that had consumed her began to subside. The shadows of the spirits flickered and writhed as if in pain, but Emma didn't stop. She reached deep within herself, pulling on the remnants of her humanity, her willpower. She pushed herself to the surface, toward the light, the warmth of her own existence that had been buried beneath the darkness. The woman's voice grew frantic, desperate. You cannot escape. You are ours, forever. But Emma didn't listen. With a final, forceful cry, she broke free from their grasp. The cavern shook violently as the spirits screamed in fury. The stone altar cracked and splintered. The ocean roared in rage, but Emma stood her ground. She was no longer a prisoner. She was free. As the last of the spirit's power dissolved into the abyss, Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her body trembled, but she could feel the curse lifting. The hunger, the lust, it was gone. The water that had once dragged her down now receded, retreating back into the depths from which it had come. But Emma knew that the beach, the curse, would not die so easily. The spirits of the lovers would never truly fade. They would always remain, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, to fall into their grasp. The cycle of hunger and torment would continue, forevermore. As she made her way back to the shore, her mind heavy with the weight of everything she had endured, Emma glanced back one last time at the cavern. The beach was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened at all, but she knew better. She had escaped the spirits, barely, but the beach of eternal hunger would forever remain, hidden beneath the surface of the tranquil waves, waiting for the next victim. Emma had survived, but at what cost? She glanced at the ocean one final time, hearing the distant whispers of the spirits calling her name, their voices growing faint as they sank deeper into the darkness. But she could still feel them, lingering, watching her from afar. And she knew that no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the hunger would never truly leave her. Story number 5. The night had been nothing short of wild, a whirlwind of laughter, music, and endless drinks. The secluded beach, far from the prying eyes of civilization, was the perfect place for a party. The sand was warm underfoot, the air thick with the scent of salt water, and the stars above were like a canopy of distant eyes, observing the chaos below. Katie stood on the edge of the bonfire, her laughter mingling with the others. The flames crackled and popped, casting long, distorted shadows on the faces of her friends. She could feel the heat on her skin, the alcohol in her veins, and the rhythmic pulse of the music in her chest. It was the perfect night. What could go wrong? As the hours passed, the group grew louder, more daring. Stories were shared, secrets spilled, and inhibitions disappeared. But somewhere in the haze of drunken revelry, something changed. The air grew still. The laughter slowed. Katie looked around, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "Where's Max?" someone called from the group, their voice tinged with the same strange unease that had begun to creep over her. Max had been the life of the party, always the loudest, the most exuberant. But now, as the momentary silence settled over the beach, she realized that Max was nowhere to be seen. "I haven't seen him for a while," said another friend, Ben, his voice unsure. "He was here a minute ago. Maybe he went for a walk or something," Katie suggested, trying to shrug off the feeling that had settled in her gut. But as the minutes passed, the uneasy feeling only grew. Max was always the first one to jump back into the chaos of the party, not one to disappear for long stretches of time. "I'll go look for him," Katie said, a flicker of concern cutting through the fog of her intoxication. The others nodded, some dismissing it with a wave of the hand, others unsure, but none seeming to grasp the growing dread that was creeping through her. She made her way away from the firelight, the darkness swallowing her whole. The beach, once so familiar and welcoming, now felt foreign. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore was no longer soothing but eerie. Katie's footsteps were the only sound that broke the silence, and the occasional rustle of leaves from the sparse trees lining the beach. She called out his name, her voice loud enough to carry over the wind. "Max? Max, where are you?" But no answer came. Her heart began to race, the dread consuming her now. She wasn't sure what was happening, but something felt terribly wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She scanned the beach, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the moon. That's when she saw something, a movement in the distance, something dark shifting in the shadows. "Max?" Katie called again, her voice trembling now. But it wasn't Max. Emerging from the trees, something stepped into the pale moonlight, a tall, shadowy figure, hunched and misshapen. At first glance, it looked like a man, but there was something terribly off about its shape. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring the fear it was causing. Katie froze, her pulse quickening as the figure drew closer. She couldn't make out its face. It was obscured by shadows, but the cold, malicious energy it radiated was unmistakable. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Then, like a sudden gust of wind, the figure disappeared back into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of rustling leaves. Katie stood frozen, her legs unwilling to move, her mind trying to make sense of what she had just seen. Had she imagined it? Was it just the alcohol playing tricks on her? But before she could make sense of anything, the scream cut through the air, sharp and piercing. It was Max's voice. She snapped out of her trance, her heart hammering in her chest as she sprinted toward the sound. The scream echoed again, this time followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. Katie pushed herself harder, adrenaline surging through her veins as she sprinted toward the trees. When she reached the source of the scream, her blood ran cold. Max was lying in the sand, his body twisted unnaturally. His eyes were wide open, staring at the sky, but there was no sign of life. His skin was pale, drained of color, and a deep red mark circled his neck, like something had strangled him. Katie staggered back, her mind unable to comprehend the sight before her. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words caught in her throat. From behind her, she heard the familiar voices of her friends calling her name, growing closer. She turned, desperate to warn them, but as they came into view, they too froze in horror. Ben was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "What happened? What is this?" Katie couldn't answer. Her mind was a whirlwind, her thoughts racing. She felt her chest tighten, suffocating her, as though the very air itself had turned against them. It's him, isn't it?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with terror. Katie shook her head, feeling dizzy. "It wasn't Max. It wasn't." Ben swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the beach as if he expected the shadowy figure to reappear. "What do you mean?" Katie looked at him, but she couldn't find the words. What she had seen, whatever that thing was, it was not human. She didn't know how to explain it, but she felt a cold, gnawing certainty deep in her bones. Before anyone could speak again, a dark shape moved at the edge of their vision. The same shadowy figure they had seen earlier. This time, the figure didn't disappear. It moved toward them with purpose, its form shifting and undulating, as if it were both solid and not at the same time. Its body seemed to change in shape, shifting into grotesque, monstrous forms. Its face, or what could be considered a face, was a warped mask of human-like features, distorted, twisted, and constantly shifting. It was not human. It was something far worse. Katie and her friends stood frozen, unable to react as the entity approached them. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, thicker. The shadows wrapped around them like chains, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then, just as the figure was within arm's reach, it stopped. A voice, cold, guttural, and yet oddly familiar, came from the thing. "You have secrets," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "I know them all. I know your guilt, your desires, your fears." Katie's blood ran cold as the thing's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. She felt her heart race, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "You thought you could escape," it continued, its form twisting and contorting like smoke in the wind. "But you never can. You belong to me now." Suddenly, the thing lunged, faster than anything human could move. Katie screamed as the others scattered, but the thing was everywhere at once. One by one, her friends were taken, their bodies contorted, their screams choked by the air that seemed to grow thicker by the second. It was as though the entity was feeding on their fear, their guilt, twisting them into something darker, something worse. The beach was no longer the idyllic paradise it had once been. It was a place of torment, a place of hunger. Katie ran, her mind a whirl of terror, her body moving on instinct. But no matter how fast she ran, the beach seemed to stretch on forever. The sound of her friends' screams echoed in her ears, the whispers of their fears chasing her down the darkened path. She realized, too late, that there was no escape. Katie's heart pounded as she sprinted through the sand, the night air sharp against her skin, her thoughts a blur of terror. Every step felt like an eternity. The beach, which had once seemed like the perfect getaway, had now transformed into a twisted nightmare. The distant sound of waves crashing against the shore seemed to mock her, like the ominous drumbeat of impending doom. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing. Yet, the unease that had gripped her heart refused to let go. The thing was there, somewhere, stalking her in the shadows, always just out of reach. She knew it was waiting, following her every move, feeding on her fear. Her lungs burned as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't hear her friends anymore. No more screams, no more frantic calls for help. Had they been taken already? Had they already become part of whatever horrifying entity haunted this place? Katie stumbled over a large rock, her ankle twisting painfully as she caught herself on the ground. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself back up, her body protesting with each movement. She couldn't stop. Not now. The trees lining the beach grew thicker as she ran further into the darkness. There was no clear path, just an endless expanse of sand and foliage, each step drawing her further from the safety of the bonfire and the group of friends she had once considered family. Her mind raced. What was this thing? What did it want? Was it some kind of monster? Or was it something worse? Something far more insidious? And how could it have known their darkest secrets, their deepest fears? The thought made her stomach churn. Was there anyone left alive? She had no idea. But as she pushed forward, an icy, suffocating sensation wrapped around her, like a vice tightening around her chest. She could feel the entity drawing closer, feeding on the terror she tried so desperately to suppress. A flicker of movement ahead caught her attention. Her eyes widened as she saw a figure standing just outside the tree line, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. Katie's heart stopped. It was Max. His body was twisted and contorted, much like the others. His once familiar face was now an unnatural mask, his eyes wide and unblinking, locked in an expression of pure terror. But what was worse was the dark, sinister energy radiating from him. He wasn't himself anymore. Whatever had claimed the others had already begun to twist his very being, turning him into something monstrous. "Max," Katie whispered, her voice trembling. But he didn't move. Max, please. What's happening? She took a tentative step forward, her hands shaking as she reached out toward him. At that moment, something shifted. The air grew thick, dense, as though the very atmosphere had been sucked away. Max's body jerked suddenly, his arms outstretched toward her with a desperate, violent motion. "Katie!" The word came from him in a voice that was not his own. It was guttural, laced with a deep, unnatural growl, as though something else was speaking through him. Katie recoiled in horror. His mouth opened wider than should have been possible, a black, viscous substance dripping from his lips as his voice turned into a sickening screech. The darkness within his eyes seemed to swirl, pulling her in like a whirlpool. "Run!" Max's voice hissed, almost pleading. "It's not over. It's never over." But before Katie could respond, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The trees around her shook violently, as though something immense and powerful was rising from the earth. The sky itself seemed to darken, the air growing heavy with a malevolent presence. Katie stumbled backward, her mind spinning in confusion and terror. She needed to get away. She had to get away before it was too late. But something held her there. A force far stronger than any physical pull wrapped around her, squeezing her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. She gasped, her vision blurring as she struggled to breathe. The world around her began to distort, the edges of reality warping and flickering. Shadows twisted and writhed, taking on strange, grotesque shapes, images of her deepest fears, her darkest secrets. Things that had once remained buried in the corners of her mind, now leaping to the surface, alive and threatening. She saw Ben, his face twisted with guilt, his eyes wide with terror. She saw Rachel, her features distorted by the horrors of her own hidden desires. Each one of them was there, standing, waiting, staring at her through the darkness. The entity was playing with her, feeding on her most intimate fears, warping reality itself. Katie's legs buckled beneath her, her knees hitting the sand. She felt her mind unraveling, her consciousness slipping into chaos. She tried to focus, to remember what she had seen before, the figure, the creature that had stalked them from the shadows. But the images surrounding her continued to overwhelm her senses. The voice again, not Max's voice, but something else, something far more ancient, far more sinister. "You will never escape," the voice whispered, crawling through her mind like a disease. "You have nothing left. Your souls belong to me now." Katie's breath caught in her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the sand behind her. She turned, but all she saw was darkness. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, I just want to go home. I just want to leave." But there was no escape. The beach had become a prison. It had become a feeding ground for the thing that had claimed her friends, and now it wanted her too. Suddenly, the sand around her began to shift, as if it were alive. Dark tendrils of sand slithered up her legs, pulling her deeper into the earth. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The sand had become a trap, a suffocating, inescapable grip that pulled her toward the dark depths below. Her body fought, her mind screamed, but the sand continued to rise, covering her, swallowing her. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own heartbeat, growing fainter and fainter until it was drowned by the darkness. And then, nothing. The suffocating darkness of the sand continued to envelop Katie's body, dragging her deeper into the earth with relentless force. She clawed at the gritty surface, her fingers scraping against the coarse sand, but it only tightened around her like a vice, trapping her in its grip. Her body was sinking, her breath growing shallow, each desperate gasp a struggle for survival. She could feel her strength fading. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over her, an odd chill that seemed to seep from the very core of the beach. It was as though the sand had become alive with its own twisted consciousness, and in the deepest recesses of her terror, Katie realized that she was no longer alone. The thing, the entity, was watching her. waiting for her to submit, to give in to its all-consuming hunger. But Katie's will was strong. She wouldn't go down without a fight. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Katie wrenched herself free from the sand's grip, her heart pounding in her chest. She gasped for air, pulling herself out, inch by agonizing inch. Her limbs were weak, but her resolve had never been more unyielding. She refused to let the beach claim her, refused to let this nightmare end with her being swallowed by the sand. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. Max's twisted form stood before her, his eyes empty, hollow, and filled with an unearthly darkness. But this was not the Max she had known. It was something else, something monstrous. "You cannot escape," the entity hissed, its voice dripping with malevolence. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of its presence, thickening with an oppressive weight. "You will be my vessel. You will become part of me." Katie's heart raced, her mind in turmoil. She could hear the voices of her friends, their whispers mingling with the sound of crashing waves, their pain and suffering echoing through her thoughts. Each one of them had fallen victim to the creature, their souls twisted and mangled by its insatiable hunger. "No!" Katie cried out, shaking her head desperately. She refused to let it win. She wouldn't let her friend's suffering be in vain. She had to find a way to end this, once and for all. In that moment, a surge of clarity washed over her. She remembered something. The ancient rituals the locals had spoken of when they first arrived. She remembered the warnings, the hushed whispers about the beach being cursed, about sacrifices made long ago to keep the island alive. But there was more, something crucial she had overlooked. The entity could only feed on their fear, on their guilt. It thrived on their darkest secrets, their most intimate desires. Katie's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening. She wasn't just fighting the beach, or the twisted, monstrous entity that had claimed her friends. She was fighting her own fear, her own darkness. She had to face it, embrace it, and sever the entity's power. With all her might, Katie screamed, not in terror, but in defiance. She called upon her inner strength, her resolve to survive. The entity recoiled as though struck, its hold on her loosening. The sand that had been dragging her down began to recede, retreating from her body, leaving her free. Max's twisted form staggered back, his features contorting in pain as if the force of her defiance was burning him from the inside. The beach itself seemed to tremble, the air thick with an unnatural energy. The waves crashed violently against the shore, as though the ocean itself was rebelling against the entity's control. "I am not afraid," Katie shouted, her voice carrying over the chaos. "You can't have me." With every word, the darkness around her began to falter. The twisted shapes of her friends, their broken, tortured forms, flickered and wavered. Their cries for help grew weaker, fading into the wind. And then, in a final, desperate attempt to reclaim control, the entity lashed out, its monstrous form rising from the depths of the ocean, a grotesque amalgamation of every fear, every secret it had collected over the years. Its grotesque eyes locked onto Katie, its mouth opening wide in a scream that reverberated through her bones. But Katie didn't flinch. She didn't waver. As the entity lunged, Katie stood her ground. She held out her arms, gathering every ounce of energy within her. And then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath her, she released it. A burst of light so bright, so pure, it pierced the darkness like a sword. The entity recoiled, its form disintegrating into nothingness, its horrible shriek echoing one last time before it faded into the void. The beach fell silent. Katie collapsed to her knees, exhaustion flooding her body. The air around her was still, as if the curse had been lifted, as if the beach itself had been freed from the entity's grasp. The ocean was calm, the waves no longer crashing violently, but instead lapping gently against the shore. She had done it. But there was no time to celebrate, no time to savor her victory. The damage had been done. Her friends were gone. their souls claimed by the beach's insatiable hunger. And though the curse had been broken, the memories of what had transpired would haunt her for the rest of her life. Katie stood, her body trembling with the weight of her loss. The beach was now peaceful, but it had taken a terrible toll, and she would carry that weight with her forever. As she made her way back to the remains of the campfire, the remnants of her friends' lives scattered across the sand, Katie realized the horror she had faced was not just a physical one. It was a battle for her very soul. And though the beach would no longer claim others, the scars it had left on her heart would never heal. The corpse collector was gone, but its legacy would live on, etched into the sands of that cursed beach, forever. Now you know the truth. The beach is more than just sand and sea. Something is waiting, and next time you dip your toes in the water, it might just be you that gets pulled under. The ocean always takes what it wants,